So I thought to get into it, maybe just tell the audience a little bit about what you do.
So my name's Gregory Burke. I've been working in fisheries for most of my life. So from about 2004 to 2015, I was working primarily for the Seychelles Fishing Authority. At the same time, I was studying. And mainly I was working on, I did a lot of work on tagging, so behavioral studies of sharks and fish, a lot of work on the tuna industry, and then also a lot of socioeconomic work, working with local fishermen and doing interviews. In 2015, I left Seychelles and I spent about 3 years in the US. I was working as a chain of custody auditor, so for Marine Sustainability Council, so looking at sustainable seafood, auditing everything from fishing operations to wholesale retail outlets, and just looking at, following the chain of custody and understanding the flow of seafood, verifying whether it does come from sustainable fisheries. And then in 2019, I returned to Seychelles. I worked as a consultant for a while on various projects, working with farmers, setting up a cooperative to provide local produce to Club Med through the LFPA group, which is, I stopped doing that, but it is still ongoing. I handed over to the farmers themselves, now operating it themselves. I then did some work doing a socioeconomic study on looking at the impacts of the co-management plan. So there was a co-management plan on fisheries that was set up with the size regulations. So I worked for about a year looking at the impacts of that on fishermen. And then afterwards, I started working 2 years ago, actually. 2 years ago in April, I started working at ICS as Director of Conservation and Science, which is the first time for me being in a purely conservation style role, in sense of I had never done that professionally before. It's always been other things. However, conservation has always been what I've been engaged in Seychelles, so it's been a nice, enriching experience. And I'm still there now, working that. In ICS, we do conservation monitoring on various islands. So I read as one of the islands that is directly managed by us, and then the other islands that are managed by IDC, and then we conduct the conservation and monitoring activities on those islands. And also when I started ICS, because I had previous experience conducting EIAs, I've been working as an EIA consultant, not doing EIAs, but doing specific parts of EIAs, so mainly the marine monitoring aspects and stuff like that. Since probably 2009, I've been involved in that. So when I started ICS, I thought it'd be a good idea just for ICS to start getting involved with EIAs, because that gives us a bit more control and oversight versus the reality of what ICS was, where quite often EIAs were conducted and ICS only really started taking part after developments take place in doing conservation monitoring. So the plan was so that we would be there from the beginning to the end.
Awesome. I definitely think it would be interesting to have another podcast where we can dive into your experience working in Seychelles and the fishing industry especially. I feel like there's so much we can go into. But I want to focus on Assomption and Aldabra today. So I guess the first thing I want to ask you is, when it comes to these outer island developments and ICS, you guys work closely with IDC, right?
Correct.
So how does that work when it comes to conflict of interest? Because I know that's one thing that's come up quite a lot, considering the fact that IDC manages the outer islands and leases them. But how does it work? Because ICS is also linked to IDC and you're in charge of conservation. So
in the time that I have been at ICS, what I've noticed is, as you say, ICS, we have the mandate to ensure that there's conservation and monitoring activities done. That is due to an MOU we have with IDC and the Ministry of, it used to be, now is called MACCE.
Can you just explain what an MOU is? I want to dig in.
So it's a memorandum of understanding. So in that memorandum of understanding, we are responsible for the biodiversity and sustainable and ensuring that there is conservation activities and monitoring. Specifically, so some specific highlights would be seabirds and things like that. But also it's grown since the original formation to incorporate a lot of other things, because we've worked on everything from seagrass to fish, sustainable fisheries, looking at those things. And so this agreement ensures that IDC, its mandate is to allow development and in a sustainable way. And ICS's mandate is to act on behalf of the Ministry of Environment on the outer islands. So when the MOU was originally put in place, the ministry did not have the capabilities to be monitoring and ensuring conservation activities. So that's why this MOU was put in place, to ensure that there was someone on the islands ensuring that all these activities take place. So that's where ICS comes in. in terms of conflict of interest, I do not believe there's a conflict of interest because we do have this MOU. And this MOU is between the Ministry of Environment, which is the government's agency that is responsible for the environment, and us as ICS to be able to conduct work on behalf of the environment on the outer islands of Seychelles. I understand that people feel that there is a conflict of interest, but in Seychelles there's conflict of interest with everything. It's such a small country.
Well, why do you think people do see it as a conflict of interest?
Well, I guess people see it as a conflict of interest because people believe that we are under the thumb of IDC and that we are not able to do our work because of IDC. I think that's an impression people have, which is quite the opposite. I mean, if you look at all the IDC islands where ICS is present, through our monitoring and through our work, we've actually shown that the environment on these islands has improved. Let's take an example for Des Roches, which probably has one of the largest developments on an outer island. So Des Roches has a large hotel in there, and the hotel is, a lot of people say, oh, that hotel must destroy the environment. But we need to take a step further back. What was Des Roches before the hotel? Now, Des Roches, like most islands, was very simply agriculture. Seychelles comes from an agriculture background, and all our islands were used for agriculture. And to do agriculture, two things were done on all of the islands. First, guano was extracted. All native vegetation was cut down. And then once they've extracted all the guano, they planted crops on the island that would bring money in. The most efficient crop that they grew, they used to grow maize, pumpkins, everything else, but the main crop was on the islands was coconuts. So almost all of the outer islands of Seychelles, except for a few, were converted into coconut plantations. Des Roches is a great example of that. And through that activity, there was a lot of damage to the environment. Now, since the hotel has been in place on Des Roches, as I say, we have an agreement to work for the Ministry of Environment, but also how ICS works then is that once we set up a center on an island, we set up an agreement. So it's an agreement and with the developers of the hotel, with ICS, with IDC, and also the Ministry of Environment, to ensure that we have in place the proper funding mechanisms to fund for conservation activities, and that we are able to ensure that these activities take place on the islands. So take place, for example, on Des Roches, where through the presence of the hotel, the number of shearwaters on the island has been increasing. Nesting sea turtle populations have been increasing. This comes from one having presence on the island, which deters poachers. But also, yes, it's true that in order to create the hotel, you had to cut down trees and you had to do development. What you've also done is, through the proper management, through ICS guiding up, is having native vegetation as the trees that are replanted within that. And having native vegetation attracts back seabirds. Also, having a hotel means you have funding to do things like pest control. For example, controls of rats and cats. Now, rats and cats on the island are some of the biggest destructors to the environment. And on Des Roches, for example, the shearwater population, there's two shearwater colonies on Des Roches. One is in the north of the island, and one is in the south of the island. The one in the south of the island is actually found within the resort. And actually, through our monitoring, what we've seen is that there's a much higher success rate and of fledging of shearwaters in the hotel versus the one in the wild. Once again, why is that? Because as I stated, all of these islands had already been, people like to say that, oh, these islands are too highly developed. But they are already highly developed. The whole island was a coconut plantation. So it was extremely developed because it was agriculturally developed. The development has changed now to more tourism development. So yes, you have buildings and yes, you have things like that, but you're removing coconut trees, you're doing control of pests, which were introduced during the agricultural period to the island, and all of that is having a positive benefit on the island. Now, there is also the option that you would do nothing on an island, do no development at all. Would that be beneficial? No, because they've already been turned into coconut plantations. So you're going to have to do something to get rid of the coconuts and bring back the native vegetation. Now, how do you do that without funding? Funding, I guess, if funding was available to preserve our islands and we could get money to preserve our islands and do all the activities, then we may not need development. But the reality is that we do need funding, and development allows funding to happen on the islands and allow us to carry out our activities of conservation, monitoring, and habitat restoration, which are all activities that ICS has been able to successfully do on all of the islands so far where we have centers on.
So tell me a little bit more about the habitat restoration. What does that look like? What does that mean?
Well, main thing for habitat restoration is, like I say, all of our islands were turned into coconut plantations. So none of the native vegetation is there anymore, except for small areas of beach crest where you might have some vuluche or you might have some bois d'oise. The interior of the island was completely cleared and planted as coconut. So with the help of IEDC, ICS has been, for example, on Des Roches, clearing coconut trees and replanting native vegetation, but also not only doing it as native vegetation, but also planting other trees that are beneficial. So using a bit of an agroforestry approach at times as well. So planting native trees that are just for there, but also planting maybe fruit trees, incorporating it, all of that. But all those trees then provide a structure for seabirds to come back in and nest. You know, coconut trees are not necessarily the best thing. Also, coconut trees, the coconut leaves take a very long time for them to decompose. They form very dense mats on the ground, which stops new growth and everything else. So all of this needs to be constantly managed. If we were to leave the islands without management, they would continue literally being wild islands covered in coconuts. So ICS's role is to do restoration, as I say, one of the things. So that has been clearing certain trees, such as coconuts, replanting with native vegetation, incorporating native vegetation into landscaping. You know, when we think about landscaping, most of the, even on Mahe, I mean, let's take Mahe, for example, right now. Every hotel in Seychelles has palm trees. I've never seen a native palm used. Native palms grow everywhere in the forest. All we would need to do is collect the seeds and have a nursery for native palms, and native palms could be used beautifully in landscaping. But it's not the case. People always take the easiest solution, which is things that they know, which are commercial plants, that people know how to grow them. So ICS also has the role, for example, on Platte Island, we're taking quite an active role in guiding the hotel to start using native vegetation, for example, pempis. Bois d'amande is a great plant to be used in landscaping. In Seychelles, it's never been used in landscaping, but in Japan, it's one of the most important bonsai plants. Now, bringing that across to developers, making them understand that native plants can be used and have benefits, not only in enriching the visual atmosphere of their resort in terms of vegetation, but attracting native wildlife back and everything else. So, those are all activities that take place and are involved in restoration. Other restoration activities can be, like I say, control of rats. Rats were introduced in Seychelles. They're not native. The only native mammals were fruit bats and the sheep-tail bats. But now that rats are on the island, it's extremely costly to remove rats. But by having development on the island, we can at least have funding to do control. And control already plays a big role, as we've seen on Des Roches, with having the control around the hotel has allowed the shearwater population to at least go by 3 times increase its population since we started monitoring. So a 3-fold increase. And we see, must say, because we have the one in the hotel and the one outside. Now the one outside, ICS does do control around as well, but it is not the same as having a hotel with money that can do control of rats on a much larger basis, which brings those benefits to the island. So that's the thing, is like the development with the right guidance does have positive impacts on the islands, because the islands were already heavily developed.
So you're talking about finding the balance between human interference and human activity on the island and nature conservation.
Well, I wouldn't say it's even finding the balance, because, as I say, those islands have already been modified. Finding a balance would be an example for an island which has never had modification, has a natural fauna, natural flora, no invasive species. In that case, it's very easy for us to take a very low-key approach and ensure that no pests arrive on the island and maintain it, which is an approach that can be done on certain islands. For example, Arid has no rats, so we do have a different approach on how management there. Or Aldabra does have rats, but because there was no major agricultural production in Aldabra, the native vegetation and things are still in place. There's no guano extraction. So in that case, you don't need to necessarily focus all your attention on restoration and balance. You can leave it. But most of the islands were used for agriculture, which means they're no longer in balance. So in fact, you need human presence there, because if you don't have human presence, then balance will never be restored, because you've already removed what's native there. So you now need help. I mean, okay, maybe in 1,000 years, the coconuts will eventually die out and native vegetation will go away. But in that time, you're likely to lose out on species that are going to move away from the island because of other impacts of not having the native vegetation there. So those islands do need help, which is why with ICS and with the help of the development in IDC, we're able to improve the habitats on so many of these islands.
But isn't there also a negative impact by having a high human turnover on the islands? Doesn't it affect the ecosystem, especially the oceans?
It can. If things are done improperly, it can have very negative impacts. I think that...
And have things always been done properly, or has there been trial and error, mistakes that have been made?
I think there's definitely been trial and error and mistakes, but I think that one thing that I would say is that IDC throughout the years has always understood that the islands are dependent on the nature and the environment around them. That's why people go to. And IDC has always understood that. As a result, it has always been in its interest to preserve the natural environment. If you look in terms of how things are done on IDC islands and how operations, how desalination is done, how wastewater treatment is done, even when you go to a fairly small island such as Platt, which has a large development on it in terms of the size of the island, when you start looking at the marine life around it and the monitoring, we currently have not seen any negative impacts from development.
Really? On Ile Platt?
Because, you know, before IDC took over the management of Platt, Platt was leased to my granddad, Ernest Bouchot.
Oh, no idea.
Why? Because he was planting coconut plantation. It was a coconut plantation. So he cut down native vegetation to do coconuts. So yes, a lot of things were cut down. Most of what was cut down on Platt was coconuts. And the other thing that people don't understand is like when a development takes place, it's always going to look bad. Let's take the example of, I don't know if you've ever been to Danseurs.
I have, yes.
What do you think of Danseurs?
The limited amount of times I've been there, I thought it was beautiful.
And I agree with you. But now if you had gone when we were actually, so the Danseurs was actually being created under under a project with the UNDP. It was originally found, and what happened was they had to bring in excavators and a workforce to dig out huge amounts of areas, cut down all the trees, dig everything up. And if you look at those pictures today, if people saw those, they would go in outcry because what you had was just a destroyed machines brushing. But why had that to be done? Because it was already had been a destroyed environment. See, that's what people don't understand is everyone says, oh, but this development is destroying the island. Yes, if an island is in its native environment, that is absolutely the case. But if an island has already been destroyed to make a coconut plantation, then by cutting down coconut trees, now it may seem bad because we're cutting down all the trees, but you need to cut down those trees to then allow the native trees to come back. So for example, on Platt, since the development has finished, since a lot of coconut trees have been cut and other trees are now coming back in force because they have space and area and they're coming up, landscaping is incorporating voluccia and other stuff, we've started seeing a large number of noddies return to the island. We've actually detected red-tailed tropic birds on the island, which we did not know were there. We've started having sightings of other birds possibly coming back to the island, such as shearwaters. Now, why is this happening? It's because yes, there's a development there, completely agree, which means there has now been cleared spaces and there is no more coconut trees. But there is other vegetation coming back, which is the volucea, which is the undergrowth, which are not massive trees, which are shrubs, but which are actually beneficial for the native wildlife. So the wildlife is coming back, and in terms of wildlife coming back to the island, we've seen that hugely happening on Platt. In terms of turtle populations, we've seen a turtle population since the hotel is there seems to be increasing. Now, is that only because of the hotel? Absolutely not. It's because 40 years ago we banned killing of turtles. But killing of turtles on Platt was happening on a regular basis until the development took place. Because now it takes 3 hours for a boat to go from Mahe to go to Platt Island, kill a couple of turtles, and come back. But now boats can't do that because there's development, there's people on the islands. So there's protection. Having people on an island does also provide protection. So you have to be able to have a balance of, are you ensuring ICS's role in to ensure conservation, management, sustainability of the islands? And we feel, and I feel, that we are being able to do this by having the development on the island. It allows us to do funding, to do restoration, to do habitat work, to control invasive species such as rats and cats. We're currently trying to eliminate cats on Platt Island because of the negative impact they're having on seabirds. And as I say, already we're seeing positive impacts on it. In terms of negative impacts, currently I have not seen personally myself any negative impacts on Platt. One possibly negative impact is that I've like many islands, hairy caterpillars.
What about lighting for the turtles? Has Île Plate followed the recommendations of people like Jean Mortimer for lighting?
Absolutely. So Jean Mortimer has been heavily involved in Platt Island. And there has been, like I said, once again, sometimes there are issues, but the moment there are issues, because ICS is on the island, we're able to address these issues with the hotel, let them know. So for Platt Island, for example, they do have the friendly, turtle-friendly lighting and everything else. There's always learning curves. There's always going to be small design changes where people do stuff, and then we have to come in and educate the resort and say, actually, yes, I understand you need lighting, but it needs to be red-colored and stuff like that. We did have some fears recently about potential light pollution, so I went up and did an assessment and everything else. And for the most part, the regulations set in Fort Jean have been followed. There was actually just one slight oversight on everyone's part, is that there is a difference between green turtles and hawksbills, and hawksbills are slightly more sensitive towards light. So while most of the protections on most of the islands, the main issues we have are with green turtles, Platt is actually hawksbill turtles. So as a result, we've had to take even further measures to address that, and it's currently has been addressed.
Okay, well, that's good to hear. I understand what you're saying. You're saying that these islands had development on them. It was a plantation. It wasn't its natural ecosystem. So you guys are just developing it in a different way.
In a sense, yes.
Yeah. Can I just bring, I don't know what the outer islands looked like before, but an example that I can maybe bring up is on Mahe, the Cheval Blanc development at Intendance. Is that the same situation? Because as far as I've seen from my own eyes, it seemed like the ecosystem had balance over there, and they just came and destroyed everything.
I think there's a big difference between developments that take place on Mahe versus developments that take place on IDC islands. And I think that is something of contention that people always see as a conflict of interest. And like I said, I do believe there's a conflict of interest. And I believe the conflict of interest is in the favor of nature. On the outer islands, nature is what tends to be prioritized first. Now, if you look at setbacks for construction, look on Mahe. Who follows a 25-meter setback rule on Mahe? Cheval Blanc did not.
Definitely
No
not.
hotel did. Have you been to you've been to some of the outer islands. Have you been to Des Roches?
I have.
Is there a 25-meter setback between?
Absolutely, and I have to just add that I think the agriculture program on these outer islands is really amazing. I was super impressed going to Astove and seeing the fact that they're fully self-sufficient and it's really well thought out. The system is well structured. I'll definitely give that to IDC and ICS because it is definitely a very big contrast to what we're seeing on Mahe.
And I think that's the main thing, is that people mainly see what happens on Mahe and they assume that the same thing happens, because people say, well, if no one can follow the rules on Mahe, then why would they follow the rules on the outer islands? But IDC has always been the ones that enforce the rules on the outer islands, and they have enforced them. They have ensured that even on Platt Island, the setbacks are 45 meters for the villas. Now, why is that happening? It's very simple. Because IDC has been in a position where it is able to tell developments, these are all rules and these are what you follow. And they have ensured, IDC and ICS have ensured that those rules are followed. So if all the rules are followed, development can take place. There is so many ways that development can go wrong. There's so many ways when there isn't the proper oversight. I think the most important thing is understanding that needs to be proper oversight to ensure that things do happen and do take place. And I think that that's been the benefit of ICS. We are lucky. We have worked on IDC islands where the environment has been at the forefront. And therefore, when we do face situations where a developer comes and says, and is given rules that you cannot build within 25 meters of the high water mark, and then we come in and say, well, actually, you can't build within 45 meters or this because we don't. And IDC supports us on those things, then it allows us to put that in place.
Does IDC ever ask you guys to make exceptions or bend the rules or?
In my experience, in the time that I have been there, I have had nothing but the support of IDC. So while I have been involved, like I say, since the beginning of this year, our involvement has more or less ceased. There's been so many changes, there's been changes with IDC and everything else, so we are still readapting. But prior to that, this relationship was excellent. we would be able to say, no, we believe that you cannot build here, and developers would say, oh, but for example, the law says this, and IDC would side with us and say, yes, but these are sensitive islands, there are additional things that need to be taken place, climate change, erosion, for example, on Des Roches, I wasn't there, but I wasn't there when the development of Des Roches is there, but I have, in my role now, had communications with the resorts, with the development and everything else, and I actually got to understand that they did not want to have these large setbacks and stuff, but it was IDC that said, no, you need to, and put in and explain to them. Because anyway, with climate change and coastal erosion, if you build 25 meters, maybe in 10 years, you're only going to have 5 meters. So therefore, move your back. So it's communication that takes place between IDC, between ICS with development. And as I have never had to yet have IDC push back on anything that we have put forward, IDC has always supported us and allowed us to bring those things forward to the table. I mean, if anyone reads the EIA document that we did for Assomption, that was done in collaboration with ICS and IDC in full support. And it says very clearly there that no construction is to take place on the coastal plateau. Every construction is to take place there. We sat with IDC, and IDC agreed to these things and are doing them. Now, does IDC is it IDC's role? No, it should be the government's role to ensure these procedures are in place. And that relationship is a separate relationship. But in terms of the relations between ICS and IDC, we have always had the fullest support in recommendations that we have put forward.
It's interesting that you say that, because it's something I hear a lot as I'm digging into this world, because I really want to understand these systems and how it works and get different perspectives. When I was in communications with, for example, MCSS, it's the same story from the conservationists. It's that, hey, the Ministry of Environment and the government are meant to enforce, and they are the ones that are meant to be overseeing these developments. But we see that there's not much of that happening. So I feel like it becomes a situation where the potato is just passed from one person to the next, and everybody's kind of like, oh, well, you know what, it's the government that's supposed to do this, but they're not doing it. And what's the solution in that situation? Because you also mentioned the MOU between ICS and the Ministry of Environment, but how involved are the Ministry of Environment? Because, for example, from my own personal experience with Cheval Blanc and Intendance, I saw that there was such a lack of response and engagement from the Ministry of Environment, not to mention the oversight, the regulations.
I said this when I first got questioned when we first did the public meeting for the development at, I think it was at Roche Caïmont Community Center, and I said right there, and I will say it again, the biggest problem with development in Seychelles is that the EIA process is flawed. Everything falls on an EIA consultant conducting the work, and then afterwards on government to ensure that it takes place, and that's where there's a big break. Where there hasn't been a break is actually on IDC islands, because quite often it falls on ICS.
But the EIA report is basically, it's the developers that fund the person who do the report. Is that not a huge conflict of interest already?
Absolutely, which is what I've always stated. In the terms of, like I say, we haven't had that issue at ICS, and we're a special case. Why hasn't it not been a conflict? Why would I say for us it's actually not a conflict of interest? Because we don't make money from EIAs. EIA is not our bread or butter. Our bread and butter is conservation work on the outer islands. So our primary objective is conservation. So when we do an EIA, we are caring about conservation. We are willing to tell the developers no.
Okay.
And we have the backing of IDC that allows us to do that. But on Mahe, it's a slightly different thing, because the EIA consultant reports directly to the Ministry of Environment. So, and like I said, I feel that there is a flaw in the system. Part of the flaw in the system is that, one, the Ministry of Environment should be more proactive and more engaged in the EIA process. They also need to have better capacity. EIAs are conducted by a team of experts in their field. Then what needs to be done is then Ministry of Environment needs to have its own team of experts that are able to follow on. And currently the Ministry of Environment does not seem to have that resource in place. So the Ministry of Environment, for it to be able to fully engage and ensure EIAs are done properly, they also need to have their own regulations, their own laws, which are currently lacking. There's, the EIA regulations and law are very limited. Guidelines, simple things. So, for example, when any development takes place on an outer island, we provide them with turtle-friendly guidelines for construction, bird guidelines, and all of these things. These are a package that are produced because we ensure this. It would be nice to see that the Ministry of Environment, when developments arrive in Seychelles, at the first stage, have a screening phase. So they know developers come, they propose, and I don't know what the first phase is. I've only been involved with an EIA. But by the time it gets to the EIA phase, there's already been pre-planning approval for certain things. What needs to happen is there needs to be a proper screening phase prior to that to ensure that developers coming are given a bunch of guidelines and a bunch of rules so they understand properly what is allowed in Seychelles and that they can adapt their project to fall into conformity with that. And I think that's currently what's lacking, is that institutional knowledge and that institutional, how can I, there needs to be a power in place that is able to enforce and ensure that things are properly, but there also needs to be the proper information from the beginning. And I think that our EIA process currently is lacking in a lot of that. And what happens, it falls on the EIA consultant to be the one that needs to bring forward everything to the developer. But by that time, the developer's already got pre-planning approval. He's already got certain things, so he's already going to say, and he's in communication with the government, and therefore there's these issues. So it has been easier for us because, one, we don't depend fully on, and also we work on IDC islands where we already have a mandate to ensure conservation and all of those things. So we have an easier time because, like I say, we had the support of IDC, where IDC is the one dealing and us dealing with developers, and we say something, we have the support of IDC. IDC doesn't say, oh, you can build with it anywhere past 25 meters. We will say, oh, well, actually, no, you can't beach the beachfront, and we have that direct communication. I think that there should be this direct communication, this better flow between EIA consultants and the Ministry of Environment. I think that currently the two are very separate, and the EIA consultants do something on one side, and the Ministry of Environment otherwise, but they don't necessarily have the experience to fully understand what's in the EIA report and to be and do not have the power to actually enforce it. And I think that's where there's a huge problem.
Interesting. I want to ask you, I want to move on to Assomption. This is very interesting. What is your personal stance on the current hotel development on Assomption?
Current stance is complicated because we are no longer involved in it. To the point that I conducted the EIA, and up to the point of that, I feel that if the EIA is followed, and if all of our mitigations are put in place, the development on Assomption will be beneficial to the island. One is that it will allow for other things, as done the EIA. If all the rules are followed, we should not have major negative impacts on the environment, but we should be able to ensure positive impacts on the environment by revegetation, proper landscape management, eradication of cats and rats. These were all requirements that were put into the EIA, and that ICS, as being the conservation managers of the island, would have ensured took place. Now my fear is that ICS is no longer involved. What we're going to have is a situation like happens on Mahe. There is going to be no oversight.
Why is ICS no longer involved?
I do not know myself. No, actually, I do know. I think that social media is a very powerful tool, but it also brings sometimes too much information and sometimes not the right information. So a lot of these campaigns against Assomption targeted ICS, that ICS did not do a good EIA.
Well, let's pause here for a second. How did you feel about that? Because there was an environmental report or assessment that was done by Overstories, Friends of Aldabra. What were your thoughts on that?
I think it was a rubbish report. I mean, realistic. They talked about tortoises. Now, tortoises are not at any risk of anything on Assomption. Even with the development, tortoises are going to be absolutely fine.
But, I mean, for example...
The other thing they talked about, they criticized REIA for not having looked at coral reefs, where the jetty was going to be. There is no coral reefs where the jetty is going to be. It's sand. So yes, we did not jump in the water and take pictures of the sand, because we know it's sand. The jetty was going to be rebuilt to the same specifications as what it was originally there. It got damaged over the years. It was going to be rebuilt. So the impacts that they are talking about, all these negative things, In our EIA, we have said no pesticide use of only native vegetation and all these things. So if our EIA is followed, all these things that overstories are going out there's no reality to it.
But I mean, I'm sorry, but from my personal experience, it seems that when it comes to certain developers, the EIA is not followed and they're given free rein to do whatever they want with no checks, and it often becomes political. We saw this with Cheval Blanc. It became a political issue.
I agree. That has never been the case with IDC and ICS.
Well, would you say it is now?
I would say yes, it is now.
It has become
It has become political. I think it has become political because of the outcry, because of social media, and people, like I say, taking the example that, oh, everything that happens on the outer island is going to be like here. And I think what has now happened is that as a result, government has stepped in now and is taking more oversight, but we already know that the government oversight is not the same level as the oversight that was already in place with ICS and IDC.
But can you understand that people like myself are really worried about the way that our country is being developed? Because it seems that over the last few years, these massive developments have been sprouting up all over our country, eating up chunks of our natural resources. And this development, I think the reason there was such an outcry is because it's right next to Aldabra. Everybody knows the importance of Aldabra. It's literally the gem
Absolutely.
of our country. And there is biosecurity risk.
Yes.
And I think also the risk of having developers who don't know anything about conservation, who don't know anything about our country at the end of the day. Last night I watched the presidential conference where the president said that this was not a private residence. But I think we all know how these developers function. We know it's going to be a private, I won't say residence in case I get sued, but a private, I'll let you guys guess.
I mean, I would describe it as going to be an ultra luxury. There will be a component, which is a private residence, and the rest of it will be a hotel, but let's be realistic. It's going to be a very high-end resort, which means very low occupancy, which means not a lot of people going to the island, which is already good because it's going to minimize impacts on the island and everything else. I once again say, yes, I agree with all your fears. That is why ICS wanted to do the EIA. That is why ICS wanted to be on the island, because we have shown a good track record with IDC of being ensuring that we are able to say no to developers. I understand that, yes, on Mahe, quite often, people are not willing to say no to developers. But that has never been the case. It has always been the case on IDC islands with the help of ICS and working together that we have been able to ensure that things are done properly.
But
so I think
SIF oversee the UNESCO World Heritage Sites
Correct.
in Seychelles, and SIF did say that they were not comfortable with the scale of the development and they wanted to see something much smaller. Did you agree with that? Did ICS agree with that point of view?
Absolutely. So ICS from the beginning involved SIF. In fact, when we did the original discussions with the developers, biosecurity has always been on the high risk. We've always kept SIF involved. We had work with SIF. We even had propositions where SIF would also have a base on the island to help ICS because they have more experience in biosecurity and everything else. ICF at the beginning did not seem interested. And we're saying that they were, at the same time, saying they were not against the development. They wanted to make sure it was being done, but they didn't want to be involved.
You mean SIF?
SIF.
Yeah.
We've now got to the point where it seems SIF is taking over. ICS has done all the EIA, has put all these things, and now we are, from what we understand, probably not going to be on Assomption. SIF, it seems, from what we've heard. We haven't heard anything official. We've heard on TV, we've heard in press releases that SIF will be taking over these activities. Now, if FIS has the capability to enforce the EIA to the level that we did and to ensure that we have said in the EIA does not get changed, then there will be no problem. But I do not see a risk to this development having any risk on Aldabra if the EIA is followed, if the biosecurity measures. And as I said, that was ICS's role. We were ensuring these things. We were making sure this was happening. When developers told us, I don't know how many times I went up to Assomption. And how many times we got into heated arguments with the developers where they said, the rules say this. And we said, well, listen, the rules are the rules. This is a natural environment. This is the reality. You have to do this. I once again think that as long as things are done properly, and as for track record, I think things have always been done properly by IDC. Historically, it can be shown. People can go to Des Roches, which is highly developed. People go to Platte, which is highly developed. Now, yes, I think Platte is too highly developed. I don't think it needs such a large thing. But has it negatively impacted the environment? No, I do not believe so, because as I say, things have changed. In Assomption, I strongly feel that the biggest issue is that people said conflict of interest and ICS is no longer involved. So we're now no longer able to ensure that what we said is taking place. We no longer know what's happening. Until ICS got kicked off the project, construction not started because we were ensuring that things were done properly. I cannot tell you what's happening now. I have not been to Assomption since we finished the EIA. I hear that there's development taking place. I hear things have started. I cannot tell you whether what we have put in place to be enforced the EIA is being done because we are no longer there.
But before we get into all of that, from the very beginning, ICS and SIF did not want a development of that scale on the island, and that was still approved. How come?
Well, like I say, pre-planning approval. I think that, you can go back to the scoping report, which was the original. So the first thing as part of the EIA process, we did a scoping report. It's publicly available with all the other things. And if you read the scoping report, I wrote it. I says very clearly, this is not classified by ICS as an eco-development. And I put options in. Re-advertise the bid. Do this. Now, I'm not government. I cannot force government. Those are the options I put. Now, ultimately, the decision comes to government. Government
went ahead.
So we cannot tell that. Based on that, as EIA consultants, we have done our best to ensure that what does happen would be done in a manner that does not damage the environment. For example, having IDC do all the construction, GICC and ID. Why? Because they know how to build on islands. They know how to do sewage treatment. They know how to do it without having negative impacts on the island. Other construction companies that might come in may not follow the same rules and have negative impacts as a result. So, yes, ICS felt that this development should never have been this big, but that is not a decision that we had involvement of. Like I say, there should be a proper screening process where these things take place. We did work with the development to reduce slightly the size of development. True discussion, but once again, we told them they had to reduce it, so they did. But government did not, so
we see another case where the government ignores what the environmentalists have to say and go ahead to favor these massive developments without really considering the repercussions on the ecosystem, the people. I want to talk frankly, openly, because it seems that is the reality.
Like I say, the biggest issue is the lack of government oversight on projects. And like I say, in the past, it wasn't a problem on the outer islands because the oversight fell to IDC and ICS. But now that we do not know where ICS is going to be involved, I cannot say what is going to happen anymore on Assomption. I no longer know. And I think that it can be very negative what happens on Assomption if things are not done properly.
Why would ICF be removed from Assomption?
Because we were not allowing the developers to do what they want. I'm going to be honest.
There you go.
Because read our EIA. We say no to things that people think is ridiculous. Now, we said no building on the sand, all building inland. The developers didn't want that. We argued with them, we fought with them, and they came to agreements with us and IDC to do that. But once our EIA is handed over and goes to planning approval then, we said we wanted to be the environmental officer so we can ensure. Like I say, it's now come to a thing where the whole thing got politicized. Because it got politicized, ICS got put in a bad light as having a conflict of interest. And once again, I say we do have a conflict of interest. Our conflict of interest is that we protect the environment. As a result, we are no longer involved. And
isn't that very convenient for the government to remove you guys and put it to the fact that it's because of a campaign or because it's become political?
No, it is very convenient. It is very convenient, but that's why I say that's the danger of social media. That's the danger of uncontrolled uncontrolled. I think social media is great, but too much information sometimes and the wrong kind of information can lead to the wrong perceptions where everyone now thinks that ICS has allowed developers to do whatever they want on the island. ICS allowed this, which is not the case. ICS put rules, regulations, and we're willing to enforce those rules and regulation. We were willing to, and we would have.
But I didn't see any content online, and I'm part of the Friends of Aldabra campaign, and I didn't see any information online that was accusing ICF of letting the letting the developers do whatever they want.
You just talked about your report that they did, which criticized our EIA, a critical overview of our EIA. That's where it all started.
But don't we want more independent environmental scientists to come in and give their opinions?
Absolutely. If they actually are scientists that understand. I've read this. The only person that somewhat understood Assomption was maybe Joey Latchkey because he'd been to Aldabra, so he'd briefly gone by Assomption and everything else. I spent a year, me and my team, going to Assomption, finding the things. I got experts. Bruno Santé had to do a full vegetation map. No one knew what... Everyone called Assomption a wasteland until we went and we proved that it wasn't a wasteland. It was actually a very pristine environment that needs to be protected. And therefore, we put in very high requirements in our EIA. So I think that none of that was looked at properly. Everyone took a scapegoat, and the scapegoat was the EIA consultants. And I think till right now, people continue, and no one is actually pointing the finger at the fact that the EIA law, the Ministry of Environment, doesn't have the capability and doesn't have the power to enforce what's being done. I mean, we all know what happened at Cheval Blanc. We've all seen it. The EIA was done and did have things, but then there's no enforcement. Everyone says it's the EIA's fault or the consultant's fault.
No, on the contrary.
Not everyone, I'm just saying, but quite often.
I would say most people blame the government. Most people that I've spoken to, the finger is pointing right at the government. It's not pointing at the EIA, but it's the system, it's the process.
Absolutely, the process is flawed. Once again, it is flawed. It needs to be changed.
Which is the responsibility of the government. And of course, there are people that are benefiting from these broken, flawed systems, but the responsibility is with the government. Yes. And I think everybody that I've spoken to definitely agrees on that point. It's very interesting because there's so much to unpack when it comes to Assomption.
No, Assomption, like I say. Assomption is a unique place. It's a beautiful place that deserves to be conserved, but also needs a lot of restoration work. And to do that, we needs funds. Development will allow funding to take place. Could it have been a smaller, less impactful development? Absolutely. Do we also need to be realistic? Assomption is very far away from Mahe and very expensive to develop. So you're not going to be able to get a low-cost development. You're not going to be able to do that on a place like Assomption.
So do you think that there's no other alternatives, that the only alternative we have as a country is to continue leasing off our islands to these massive developers and giving them complete access for 70 to 99 years?
I mean, I don't know what other options currently we have.
We don't,
available.
But should we not be creating those options and thinking outside the box and empowering our nation?
We should think outside the box, but we should also understand that we are very spread out over a very large area. Assomption is very far away. I mean, like I say, let's take the example of Aldabra. Aldabra is currently looking at trying to eradicate rats and cats. It's going to cost them, they estimate, $20 million or so. They have means to be able to have gotten funds, and it's taken them many years, and they're able to do that. Assomption also, we need to remove cats, we need to remove rats, we need to do a lot of work on Assomption. So, how do we do that? Now, yes, SIF does a lot of stuff on Aldabra, but also there's a lot of information lacking on Aldabra. Biodiversity assessments, do we actually know what's on Aldabra? Aldabra is so large that apart from a small research center at one part of the island where work takes place, there is a lot that still needs to be done on Aldabra. Luckily, Aldabra is very pristine and everything else, so we can take a very laid-back approach where we continue to collect information at a very slow pace. That's not the case in many other places, on many other islands, which I say have already been heavily impacted in the past by humans, which require possibly more active activities to take place. And as I say, it all comes down to funding. If ICS was able to get funding to do conservation work on the islands without the need of development, that would be great.
And that's not a possibility.
No. I mean, people always say that there's so much funding going around and everything else. Maybe, but it comes with other reporting requirements and everything else that take a lot of stuff. Also, the cost of setting up a center and putting staff on an island and getting support so they can be on an island and live out there is very expensive. For me to put a team of 3 people on an island, I need to feed them, provide them food, electricity, supplies to do their stuff, office, housing. All of these things costs. Now, if every year a generous donor can donate a couple of million US dollars to ICS so that we can conduct our activity works, that would be great, but that would be every year. I'm not saying a one-off thing, because that is the cost. The cost of conservation, the cost of doing it is expensive. People need to realize that. The cost of removing rats once on Aldabra is going to cost 20 million, right? What about everything else that needs to be done?
Don't you think that there are projects that the Seychelles government can create and put in place themselves that will bring in those funds?
Absolutely, and I think that there is many ways to do it, and I've seen that ICS has shown that with development, we are allowed to fund conservation activities and do monitoring work and do everything else. So I think there needs to be development to allow this to happen. Once again, whether development of this size or this amplitude should have been allowed, that goes back to a screening process.
Do you think that it should have been allowed?
No, I said so in the thing. I said, no, I don't think it's an eco. I think we advertise for an eco development. I do not think that this is an eco development. I made that very, very clear.
And for example, when it comes to the airstrip,
yeah.
So when you guys expanded the airstrips, there was no permission from Ministry of Environment and there was no environmental report, right? That was shown on Michel Murray's documentary, the Grand Reportage documentary.
There was a Class 2 EIA conducted by the Ministry of Environment. So Class 2 EIAs do not require EIA consultants to do it. Internally, the Ministry of Environment evaluates, and I actually saw that document. They sent it to me because I wanted to see it, and they did allow the development.
But there was no permission granted.
Yes, there was
before
permission.
The airstrip was expanded, no?
No, there was permission granted. There was clearing that took place first. Now, I understand that Michel Murray has pictures of clearing taking place. Clearing had to take place because in order to expand, so...
Well, she also has the pictures of the airstrip that has been...
Concreted. No, she had the pictures of when they cleared the vegetation. They had to clear the vegetation because one of the requirements was to do ground penetrating radar. Assomption is not Mahe, it's not a granitic island, it's a karst ecosystem, so it's got large caves and everything. So even before they actually had to do the construction, they had to be able to do a full seismic study of the island. So they had to clear vegetation along the path of the actual airstrip. And I was there when that happened, and they had a team come from South Africa with ground penetrating radar to do surveys of the whole airstrip to be able to see where the airstrip could be built and whether it could actually be built, where there was holes in the ground. So yes, the land was cleared, but the actual construction happened afterwards.
Okay.
The clearing was done so that they could do the ground penetrating radar, which was a requirement that needed to be done.
And some of the sand dune had to be broken or dug into for the airstrip. Is that right?
Yes. Once they got approval for the airstrip and once everything was done, they started using sand from the sand dunes in order to make the airstrip. That had already been done, so the original airstrip had also taken sand from the sand dunes to construct, and for the expansion, also they used sand. Since we handed in our EIA, we have not been back to Assomption.
Since you handed out the EIA?
Since the EIA was approved.
Oh, wow.
We were in discussions because we were supposed to, I actually brought in staff, because part of our thing was to have a staff on the island to do biocons. So I brought in staff, I had everything in place, but as I say, it seems we are no longer going to be involved. We do not know.
Did you have any communication since the EIA report?
No. We started communication not long after we submitted it to start putting the biosecurity. So we've had a lot of communication with IDC. So IDC has already put in biosecurity measures. So for all the flights going out to Assumption or to Aldabra, on the way to Assumption, any flight through Assumption, all cargo leaving Mahe, biosecurity measures have been put in place. So everything that was on that we are still able to enforce from our side through IDC, we've still been able to do. So we've been working with IDC to ensure the biosecurity measures are in place for all cargo and everything going from Mahe to Assumption. All flights going out, all the biosecurity measures are in place. So we're still in communication with that, and we're still assisting when we can. But that's the limit of what we're able to do right now. Is because of our relationship with IDC, we're still involved because we were the ones who were supposed to do it. But on terms of communication with the developers or SIF who are now overseeing that, technically, according to what we've heard, we have not had any communication, no.
Interesting. Well, allegedly, they are still building. I've seen pictures,
Well,
I've seen videos.
Yes, I've heard a lot. I mean, like I say, while we were on the project, no building had started. We are no longer there, and we have heard that building has started, and we are concerned.
And have you reached out to the government with your concerns?
Yes, we have.
And you have not received any responses?
We have sent out a formal complaint inquiry several times. We have not had responses. We tried contacting.
Who did you send which departments did you send these complaints to?
The office of the president, because the speech was really done by the president saying that, to Bernard Georges, leader of opposition, also chairman of SIF, to SIF. We've tried several different channels. We've asked for clarification on certain things, but to date we haven't really. We've been told without written confirmation that we will be involved, but as in terms of a written confirmation saying, yes, we are still involved, anything like that, no, we have not received anything.
So right now, as far as you know, the development is still continuing.
Yes.
And you have no part of it.
No part of it. Other than, like I say, that we are still helping IDC with ensuring that the biosecurity measures are being undertaken, at least here on Mahe, because we're able to do that, and we do have a relationship with IDC. As in terms of what's happening on Assumption, we do not know.
Allegedly, there was a flight that came in straight from, I'm not sure if it was somewhere in Qatar, straight to Assomption. Allegedly, I have no proof of this, but I don't know if you know anything about it.
I have heard of it out as well, but same thing, like I say, as we are not on Assumption, it's difficult for me to know. Per the EIA, flights from internationally would be allowed, but there would need to be then the biosecurity screening and measures in place at the embarkation at Assumption.
And immigration, right?
And immigration, yes. All immigration, everything. Per the EIA, there is exceptions with those flights, but all biosecurity measures had been accounted for in the biosecurity management plan for that. Currently, since I do not know whether there is a biosecurity team, well, there's no ICS conservation team or anyone on the island, and it sounds like SIF, then I assume SIF must have done some biosecurity.
It feels really messy.
Yes.
And really dirty, if I'm very honest.
Oh, for me, it feels very dirty. I sacrificed a lot of time over the past 2 years on the Assumption project, work on it to make sure it was done properly, only to see that all our hard work was pretty much thrown down a drain. I do not know if the EIA is being adhered to. I do not know if all requirements are being adhered to, because I'm no longer involved.
Thrown down the drain by who? By government?
I mean, they're the one responsible for it. My job was to do the EIA, which was then granted approval by government. It's now government's role to ensure that things are done properly. We had suggested that we would be the ones to enforce it, but because of accusations of conflict of interest.
This is where I have a disconnect with you. The accusation of conflict of interest was simply pointing out that there was a conflict of interest. And don't you think it's important to point these things out and have these conversations and bring these things
like
to
I
light?
say, I agree there's a conflict of interest. All conflict of interest is that we care about the environment more. So I have no issue with saying there's a conflict of interest. I would just like people to understand that conflict of interest can work in both ways. In a case where it can be negative, it can be all conflict of interest is that we care more about the environment than the developers. There's our conflict of interest.
But do you honestly think that it's because of the campaign of Friends of Aldabra, for example, that now the government has removed ICS?
I believe it gave them, yes, I do believe that.
So they've used that as leverage.
Absolutely. I think that that's why I say that the information put out, yes, it's a conflict of interest, but did not, no one came and talked to us. No one approached ICS. I'm talking now, 6 months after everything has been done, and I'm saying I agree that it's a conflict of interest, and I'm explaining the conflict of interest. No one came to ICS.
Who is no one?
Friends of Aldabra never came to us.
No one from Friends of Aldabra got in touch with you guys?
No.
Okay.
No, I've never received a single email, a single call. I've never been contacted by Friends of Aldabra. None of them. Victoria Duthill, all these people that are campaigning, none of them have contacted ICS. ICS, there's not just me, there's other staff, and none of us have been contacted.
They have definitely contacted the government and IDC, if I'm not mistaken.
Possibly, but not us.
It's interesting. So where does that leave us?
Like I say, currently we at ICS ourselves have sent in letters requiring more clarification, more understanding, because we would like to know what is happening. We would like to ensure that the measures that we put in place are being adhered to. We don't want to see it all go to shit. We don't want to see the environment destroyed. We had done at the EIA, we had spent a lot of time working with the developers, with IDC to ensure that things would be done properly. And now we are in a situation where we don't know whether that's going to happen. And as a result, there could be negative impacts. But I guess what for me is the most confusing is the fact that it seems that SIF is now going to be the one responsible, and that suddenly there's development has started, whereas there wasn't development happening, and we now hear all these rumors. So it leaves us in a situation where we don't know anymore where we stand. We don't know what's happening.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm trying to find out, because every person I speak to has a different story, different piece of the puzzle. There's a lot of hearsay as well, so it's really challenging to figure out the truth.
Well, like I say, we have written official letters, but we have not been received any responses back. So we've written to government, we've written to SIF, we've asked for clarification. The only information that ICS has received is press conferences or press releases by SIF, which don't necessarily say much. There's been very little to almost no mention of ICS, honestly. I think ICS occasionally is mentioned sometimes, but in most of the time it's not. It's MOUs being signed with SIF and IDC and the developers. No mention of ICS. So we no longer know ourselves. We haven't been given any formal clarification. It's just a lot of, like you say, things that we hear. We just have to, as a result, we are in a sense in limbo. Say, I had brought in staff. I've had to take those staff and put them on other islands. So it's been problematic for me. Some of the staff I'm probably not going to be able to hire anymore. So I'm going to have to terminate, well, tell people that I won't be able to take them. It's caused a lot of stress.
So what are you guys going to do now that you haven't been getting a response? Are you going to push back?
Well, like I say, we can't really push back. We operate on an MOU between IDC, the government, and ICS, which means that we act on behalf of the government on those islands. If we are not being given and told that we can do things, and not that we can't just go and set up a center on Assomption.
No, but I mean, if you haven't received a response, is there anything you can do in that sense?
I mean, we will eventually have to go like I am doing now, in a sense I'm talking publicly. But I mean, I think that's the only thing to do right now, is to try and publicly try and understand what's happening and get information. I'm still hopeful that we may get a response. Like I say, it has been mentioned that ICS will be involved, so I can still hope that we will be.
And what do you suggest for people like myself who really deeply care about Seychelles and who care about the environment and who are worried about the way Seychelles is moving forward and the manner in which these developments are being pushed through and carried out?
I mean, I think people need to understand that development can be positive or negative. I think that historically, if you look at IDC and IDC islands, development has always been done in a way that is beneficial for the environment. So I think it should continue in that way. There should continue to be a system where there's a proper oversight in place, where IDC is able to enforce things, is able to take that role along with ICS to be the people that fight for the environment on the islands and ensure it takes place. Say, I don't know what's going to happen now, but I would like to see it that, there is an outcry that takes place to hold government accountable, to ensure that the EIA is adhered to. It's there, it's in the public domain, it's very clear what is allowed and what is not allowed, and I would just like to see someone, if it's not ICS, be it government, be it SIF, actually ensure that what is in the EIA is being adhered to. And I think that as long as there is no new surprises around the corner, I think IDC has a development plan every 5 years it produces. The new development plan charts what islands it expects to develop. I think if you look at it, there is not much more development. Assomption was one of the projects they had on the books. The other one would have been Grand Barbe, where they also had a project on the book. There's plans to do a small development on Rainier Island. And then there's the plans to do agricultural stuff potentially on Koichivi. But apart from that, the policy that IDC has always had is one hotel per island. So I don't see a risk of uncontrolled development taking place unless that policy of one hotel per island goes away now. But with it in place, I think that as long as it is still there and as long as the EIAs are followed, then there shouldn't be a problem. I mean, yes, there'll be a development on Assumption, but as long as it's done properly, it'll be fine. There won't be other developments on the island. So as long as...
So do we have to kind of just wait now to see if they follow the EIA and do things properly?
I mean, what else can we do?
Well, that's what I'm asking. What can we do to take more initiative as the people of Seychelles? How can we empower ourselves to maybe also challenge and change these systems to make sure that there's more transparency?
Hold government accountable.
How? How do we do that when they don't respond, where clearly it becomes a political agenda? And I feel bad for a lot of these people in ministries. For example, the Ministry of Planning and the Ministry of Environment. I know that there are people who truly do care and are trying to do their job as best they can. But when it comes to certain developers, their hands get tied because the orders come from the top. And I'm not afraid of saying this because I've seen it firsthand. I've experienced it firsthand.
Absolutely.
So what do we do? And you're an environmentalist. You've even worked in the fishing industry. So I'm sure you have a thought, an idea, an opinion.
I mean, okay, not speaking on behalf of ICS now, but I'm speaking on behalf of myself and having worked with SFA, having worked with the tuna industry, having seen development as a Seychelles in Seychelles. I think we need to stop taking money and stop taking free money and start actually working to develop ourselves. Look at our fishing industry. The tuna industry we don't catch tuna. We allow a EU fleet to come in, destroy our oceans, and we get peanuts for it. What money do we get from the EU fisheries? We get money because they buy fuel from us. Most of the money comes through SAPEX sale of fuel, not actually to anything else. It's bunkering fees, it's things like this. I think Seychelles need to start realizing that we are a beautiful country, we have an amazing environment, and we can actually make a lot of money out of environment. And I think that everyone needs to start realizing that that has been happening in Seychelles. Take the IDC example. You just went to Astove. There's a development on Astove. There's development on Farquhar. There's development on Alphonse. There's development on Desroches and on Plat. And you go to any of those islands and you will see better and nicer nature, better marine life than on Mahe. Why is that? That's what I'm saying.
I agree with you. From the islands that I've visited, except for Île Plate, I'm not sure how I feel about that development.
Like I say, I think Île Plate, once again, I will go back to and say, I think it was too highly developed. I would have loved to have seen less development take place. But at the same time, I'm also realistic that a highly developed coconut plantation turned into a highly developed hotel, and that in terms of the environment, it hasn't gone back to its pristine state, but it's definitely better than the state it was, that it was just a pure coconut plantation.
I understand what you're saying. You're saying that it's better to have human development and be able to control the ecosystem and rehabilitate it rather than just leave the islands the way that they have been after all of the all of the destruction has already taken place. I understand that point of view. I don't know enough about it to agree or disagree at this point, but I just want to go back a little bit. When you say that, from your perspective, not under ICS, but from your personal perspective, when you say that Seychelles should stop taking money and actually work to develop our own resources and our economy, what does that look like in an ideal situation?
Oh, I mean, realize that we need development, firstly, but that we need development that is beneficial to everyone. A development that is only beneficial to government or to, you know, only brings us financial benefits in terms of money in government isn't necessarily the only thing that's good for Seychelles. What we need is developments that have a social aspect as well, that allow us to have better employment, that allows people to visit the islands, that allows access to information. All of those things need to be there. So Seychelles needs to stop looking at developments that are only going to bring in
Quick money.
quick money. There you go. Quick money that will eventually only be temporary. Because quick money is fine if you keep getting it continuously. But getting a quick money up front that will then destroy the environment, that once the 99-year lease, for example, is over and an island is no longer, that's not worth it. What you need to have is, okay, fine, we're leasing an island for 99 years. We want to get money for that development, but we wanted that once that 99-year lease is over and the island comes back to the government of Seychelles, we still have an island that we can be proud of, that has benefited, even though there's been a development that take place on the island. I think that's what we need. When you look at the long-term picture, I don't have an issue with 99-year leases. They've always been the case in Seychelles. 99-year leases were what my granddad had 99-year lease on Platt back in the day. So that's the thing. But I think what we need to have is, okay, fine, let's give a 99-year lease, but there has to be conditions. The lease can be terminated. That's fine. But the main thing is that at the end, we need to ensure that when the island is returned, there has been a net benefit, not only financially, but also in the environment and in the social aspects that have improved on an island. So I think that's what we need to do. You know, having a development just so we get a whole bunch of money, but then that development doesn't bring anything else in the long term, doesn't bring any positive benefits to the island, that's where we need to put our foot down and say no. Say, okay, it's fine for you to come and develop in Seychelles. We're happy to have development, but there are rules that will need to be followed. If you break those rules, there will be consequences, and that there's enforcement in place. And I think if that happens, then we have no issue. But I think that the issue comes when we just say, okay, well, we're going to get quick money, we're going to lease an island for 99 years for this development, and after 99 years, we forget about it. As long as we get, that's, you know, we need that it's in a day that there's continuity in the sense that right now we just looked at quick money at the beginning, and 99 down the line we may not getting any money. Same with fisheries. You know, right now we're getting tons of money, they say, from the tuna fisheries. But once the fishery is gone, what have we got then?
I feel like Seychelles prioritizes these exploitative developments and companies.
Yeah. No, I would completely agree with you, especially when you look at the tuna industry and the fact that there is this, yeah, like you say, it's a big slap in the face to the small-scale fishermen when they have regulations on size limits and this, and you've got the industrial tuna fleets that can do pretty much whatever they want without any real regulation, and they're causing massive harm to our environment. And then you've got the local fishermen that's suffering. I think the same thing happens at times with developments that take place in Seychelles, where they're purely for the benefit of foreigners and no benefit or whatsoever to Seychelles, and I think that's where we need to stop. I say we need to think of it in a more holistic approach,
Yeah.
where nature development goes hand in hand, but not to exploit till we finish and then bugger off. We need to be that development allows us to sustainably exploit in the long term. Like people say, denying access to fishermen on the outer islands. There are There are cases where fishermen are denied access around certain islands for certain activities inside lagoons and stuff in order to be able to preserve populations and stocks and stuff. That needs to be done. Is there any regulation saying what can be done? No. So technically there is no, neither IDC nor ICS has a mandate to be able to stop people fishing on the outer islands. I think there's a huge problem with spearfishing in Seychelles. I don't need to need to go to the outer islands. Spear guns are supposed to be legal, and spearfishing is supposed to be legal in Seychelles. There's people spearfishing around Mahe every day. Like I say, the law says they're not allowed to do that. I know that on ICS, where ICS is present, we will definitely not allow spearfishing. Of course, what happens outside our eyes, just like what happens outside the Isles of SIF, I'm pretty sure that SIF would never allow spearfishing there. So there's things that you are not able to see and control. But I think that is now government regulation. The law says no spearfishing is allowed, and I think that needs to be taken seriously. I have also heard allegations of all these spearfishing activities taking place. For years I've been hearing it, but once again, even when I was SFA, we heard about it and we tried. Once again, it becomes quite complicated if government isn't willing to enforce it. The problem is, whether it's government will or whether it's lack of qualified people or what it is, I do not know. I worked in government. I worked at SFA for 10 years. Be realistic, there is a lot of power from up above that comes down and tells you what you can and cannot do. That's why I left SFA. That's why I now work for ICS. Until recently, I never had powers above at ICS, until suddenly now, where it seems things have become political and we've been taken off things. But yes, I think government needs to actually start implementing rules and laws. For example, Cheval Blanc is not within 25 meters setback to the construction. We all know it.
Yeah.
Government needs to do something about it, whether it be issue fines, whether it may bake them up. Something needs to be done.
There has been zero accountability.
No. And that's the thing, is like, the reality is government needs to be accountable. Who holds government accountable?
The people.
The people, exactly.
And that's why we're having these conversations.
That's why these conversations are important. It's important these conversations do take place, and there needs to be accountability. The biggest thing, like I say, from that meeting when I did down at Oshkaimo, I said the biggest problem with the EIA department, with EIAs, is that it is a flawed system where there's no accountability. All the accountability falls on the EIA consultant. That's not how it's supposed to be. We are not government. We cannot enforce anything. We can put in mitigation measures, but we have no legal grounds. ICS cannot fine someone. Only government can do that. So government needs to be able to say no, needs to be able to make a decision. And I think there are people within government that are very capable, but I think there are also a lot of people in government who have been sitting very comfortably behind desks, getting a big salary to do nothing. And I think that it is time that we realize that, Seychelles voted for change. That's why there was a change of government. But whilst there was a change of government, there hasn't been a change anywhere within government.
Nope.
It's the exact same people. I've heard promises about people being, that there needs to be accountability, and people, but I haven't seen any of that. And unless that actually happens, there's nothing we can do. We actually need, it's fine to change a government every 5 years, but unless the structure below also changes, you're never going to have anything. And I think that right now there's a lot of people, like I say, that are very comfy, sitting down, not really working, just signing off bits of paper, and that's it. And that's why I say the EIA department needs to also have specialists. It can't be only the EIA consultants that have teams of specialists that are doing the work. But if government doesn't have a skilled and qualified people also doing their jobs, also able to understand an EIA, understand the importance of certain things, then nothing's going to take place. I think a complete shuffling, complete reorganizing of government, it needs to take place, because the current way that the Seychelles administrative system seems to work isn't working.
It's a very top-down approach, isn't it?
From my experience, yes. I think that, I think that Seychelles sometimes is, we're a small nation, we're young. Until those elections, we hadn't really understood what transparency in election, everything else has. But I think we were already in a stage where there was transparency and things taking place. I think the government of Danny Four had been bringing that, and we were just wanted further change. But I think that possibly in that further change, we actually stagnated.
Yeah.
Because we got something completely new, but they weren't fully capable of putting the change in place, and we've therefore stagnated.
It seems that we also made a mistake by giving them all the power.
Richard Quest said so. Right after elections, they interviewed Richard Quest, and Richard Quest said the biggest problem is you now have government that controls everything.
And we have seen why that is such a dangerous situation.
I mean, if we're going to be talking, and we talked earlier about conflict of interest, who's the chairman of the board of SIF? He's also leader of National Assembly.
Yeah.
He's also on the board of ICS. We need transparency. We need accountability. And those are two things that are sorely lacking in Seychelles, is that we have no transparency, really, no accountability. Once again, speaking more as as I worked for the Seychelles Fishing Authority for years, and even after I left them, I did a consultancy for the Seychelles Fishing Authority where, I was supposed to look at the impacts of the regulations on fishermen, and I talked to fishermen and got their points of views, and I interviewed 168 fishermen and got their point of views. And then when I presented that to the government, to the Seychelles Fishing Authority, I was just retold, yes, but you can't say that. And I was told, change my results and they'll accept my report. I never changed my results.
Well, that's what we see often in these situations, and I think that that's why the conflict of interest between IDC and ICS was initially brought forward, because we've seen such abuse of power and manipulation at the end of the day. I feel like a lot of these conflict of interests are self-serving. So unfortunately, in this situation, it sounds like it's been weaponized.
It's definitely been weaponized, the conflict of interest. And like I say, we need to, once again, let's take everything in context. Conflict of interest is a term that is very easy to use in a country with population of 1 million. We've got a population of 80,000. We all know each other. You and me went to school together.
Yeah.
Everyone, it's not like, MNAs, ministers, they come to my parents' restaurant. I see, we're not a disconnected world. In Seychelles especially, everyone has a conflict of interest because we're so small. We need to admit that. Conflict of interest will always exist in Seychelles. But if we have transparency and accountability, even with conflict of interest, we can ensure that things are done properly. And there will always be conflict of interest in Seychelles because, guess what? Everyone is somehow related through family or through work or through who you went to school with. We all know each other. But as long as we have a proper regulatory framework, proper guidelines, proper enforcement, and proper oversight, it doesn't matter if there's conflict of interest because we have a way forward. And when the conflict of interest goes bad, it's easy to see, it's easy to address, it's easy to fix. But there'll always be conflict of interest in Seychelles. We just need to accept that and ensure that we have the proper oversight and transparency in place that we can live with that.
And not just rely on the government's word that they will handle it.
No, absolutely not.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate your time. I appreciate this discussion. I think it's really important to see both sides. Is there anything else that you want to add or that you want to say?
No, I would just like to say, I think a lot of people still haven't read the EIA report, and I think that people need to read our EIA report, and people need to petition government, not to stop a development because the development is going to go forward, but to petition the government to ensure that the regulations and the EIA and everything that are followed. It's not our decision ultimately on whether development is going to go through or not. Let's be realistic, government's going to make that call. But we can be responsible for ensuring that the development takes place in a manner that has positive benefits for the environment versus having negative impacts. And the way to do that is for the people to hold government accountable for the EIA. The EIA document was accepted by government. They gave an authorization letter which says that the EIA must be followed. It's now everyone's role to take that EIA, read it, and every time show it to government and make government know that they are accountable. If this is breached, we need to hold them accountable.
We tried to do that with Intendance. We really did.
Yeah.
And doesn't seem like we made a dent.
I don't know. I think a dent has been made. I think there's elections this year. And I think after elections we'll realize. But I think that most probably I think that there has been impact of all these things that are happening place. I think that the lack of government accountability, people have seen that today. People have realized that. And I think that that will bring about something coming forward. Be nice if things could happen faster, but those are called revolutions. not democracy, but sometimes revolutions have more benefits in the short term. But we do live in a democratic system, so we've got
Do we, though? Do we really?
Yes, we do. Just democracy is not what people think it is. Democracy is a term. Most people think that democracy means perfect. Just like most people, like the definition of communism is not what communism is today. I think there's always some people that are powerful and care more about money than about other things, and that is when problem happens place. I think money is important, money is needed, but there's many ways that Seychelles can develop and continue to develop without the need to completely destroy the natural environment. And also, I think that one of the biggest problems in Seychelles is social issues, drugs,
Yeah.
alcohol, and I think if those things are already addressed, that would help bring things better, because a drugged and alcoholic population isn't going to stand up and fight for their rights because they don't know their rights.
Isn't that convenient?
Oh, absolutely, it's convenient. I mean, the heroin problem that no one seems to acknowledge in Seychelles, and the alcoholism problem that no one seems to acknowledge in Seychelles is very convenient for governments. I mean, that's what the British did. The British used opium to control the colonies. Governments can use alcohol and heroin to control populations very easy.
Interesting.
That's not something new in Seychelles, just to make it clear.
I know.
I'm not blaming that on one particular thing. I'm
No.
saying, though, that drugs and alcohol are definitely a political tool in Seychelles and have been for many, many years, and no one seems to want to address it, because why would you sharpen the knife that can cut your neck? There's definitely certain interests. Like I say, when it comes to the tuna industry and when it comes to a lot of other things, there is short-term benefits that people care about, and
And
that's all they care about.
Yeah, and it's so layered that you get lost in the layers and you don't understand the lingo. And I know I felt too uneducated in a sense to even start having these conversations and asking these questions, because you get lost in all the layers.
No. There's a lot of complexity, and things are complex, which is why experts are needed, which is why it's good to have social media, but it's also good to have the right information out there, the right transparency out there, the right accountability out there. And I think that is what just needs to happen now. I think that the people need to realize they have the power. They can stop things, but they also have to be educated enough to be able to make the decisions. And if we have educated people in positions of power, that is when things will get better. Having people in power just because of political reasons is never going to bring about change. Change will happen in Seychelles when the government realizes that it needs to listen to experts. It needs to listen to people that are not there for politics, but are there for their expertise. And I think we still have a lack of that in many aspects of Seychelles. I think there are definitely some people in Seychelles who are willing to fight for change and willing to change things. But I think that without government actually listening to experts, without actually incorporating the opinions of experts and doing everything only for political reasons, then we're never going to get anywhere.
Yeah, I'll agree with you there. Thanks again for your time, Greg.